Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Gordon Brander. Gordon is a technologist and researcher and currently working on Deep Future, an AI tool to help facilitate scenario planning. Gordon has previously worked in design and engineering in such places as Mozilla and Google and employed scenario planning there, and wants to now democratize this mental framework more broadly. Gordon and I had a chance to discuss the history and nature of scenario planning, how it works, and what it's useful for. We explored risk versus uncertainty, epistemic humility, Knightian uncertainty, the research and process of scenario planning, the perils and misuses of scenario planning, as well as Gordon's AI-powered tool for this process called Deep Future, which I'm also advising. Gordon even shared how scenario planning has changed how he thinks about society and the world. There was so much wisdom in this conversation, and I had a great time speaking with Gordon. Let's begin. Gordon, welcome to the Orthogonal Bet. You're doing a lot of work related to scenario planning, and so I wanted to discuss all of that. But I guess maybe the best place to start is just with explaining what scenario planning is and like why people use it, how it is useful, upsides, downsides, what it is. That might be a great place to start.
Yeah, I guess it's worth noting why I got into it in the first place. Like I'm kind of a product guy.
That would be great too.
And as a product guy, I basically am always trying to stay 2 steps into the future. And I had been working a lot on products that I guess I would call them ecosystem products. So my fascination with this stuff started at Mozilla, where I was working on Firefox, an operating system called Firefox OS that didn't work out too well, some VR stuff. Later on, I was at Google and was doing some interesting stuff with AR and VR, as well as the web. And all of these kind of large-scale ecosystem products, they have a lot of different users. And you can't really just kind of grind up and to the right like you might with another kind of product. There's a lot of nonlinear effects. They're what I guess scientists might call a complex adaptive system, right? You poke them and they move in an interesting way, maybe not the way that you anticipate. So as a product person, I was looking for tools for thinking through this and started getting into scenario planning. I understand you had Nick Foster on the pod as well, who has gone really deeply into this stuff, as well. So he might maybe do better than I at going into some of this, but I'll do my best. So I guess scenario planning started a long time ago. It actually has a kind of military background. There's a fellow named Herman Kahn who worked at an organization called RAND during the Cold War. I think this is the 1950s.
I feel like there's like rumors that he was also the basis for Dr. Strangelove. Is that is there anything to that? Have you heard that?
Yeah, I think that's right. He wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, which was, I guess, maybe there are a couple books like this that he wrote that kind of explored what ifs around the horror of nuclear war. So he was a kind of strange character, right? Like a really wild character, very divisive. But I think what he contributed was this idea that maybe we should be making plans by trying to push out somewhat into the future, thinking about the knock-on consequences of our decisions. And in his case, a lot of that was sort of these very catastrophic nuclear exchange type scenarios, and Kubrick was inspired to sort of craft this character of Dr. Strangelove after Herman Kahn. So I mean, it's a bit of an interesting, maybe dark kind of history behind it, but it then got sort of picked up by others. There was a fellow named Pierre Wack who worked at various places, but most famously at Shell, the petroleum company. And they developed a lot of the methods. I think Herman Kahn was sort of doing a first principles kind of approach to this stuff. Pierre and others kind of built out a more structured set of methods to be able to dig more deeply into the forces that are sort of driving events and to analyze those. And they, it seems correctly, anticipated an oil shock in the 70s, and I guess that was a pretty big deal for Shell. So it was kind of a proof point that the methods were interesting and potentially high leverage, and they diffused in really interesting directions. So you actually had people like Peter Schwartz and his Global Business Network in the 80s. There's a very strange genius around that.
Well, I was saying, there was that, right? Like Stuart Brand was involved, but like
Stuart Brand, Brian Eno,
Peter Schwartz, he was at Shell even before Global Business Network. I think is that also where he learned some of this or am I misremembering this?
No, I think that might be right. I believe he spun out of Shell and started Global
Okay,
Business Network, and they began diffusing a lot of these methods into
that's really interesting.
strategy in general. So today it's used a lot in not just business and defense, but also environmental planning, like what is climate change going to do? How is that going to affect, maybe the future of our city? How do we prepare for that? What kinds of things might we implement to mitigate or prevent its worst effects? And I got really into this because I was sort of grappling with how do we sort of tackle these problems in a product context, and found it really useful for that.
And to scenario planning, it's not as much about trying to extrapolate curves and kind of predict the future. It's much more about kind of building specific scenarios of like, okay, here are a few different ways that the world could go. So it's less probabilistic, or is that, or maybe there is probability kind of involved. Like how would you distinguish scenario planning from other ways of thinking about the future?
Yeah, it can be probabilistic. There's this quote by Donella Meadows, who was one of the early kind of people pioneering simulation and scenarios and decision making. She said, systems fool us by presenting themselves as a series of events. So I really like this insight. And I think this is really what scenario planning is about. It's not about predicting a particular future. It's more about trying to scratch at the system underneath the events to try to deduce what's sort of generating these events and get a better understanding of it. So a lot of what you do in scenario planning is look at the environment around you, like who are the major actors, what are the low-level forces that are driving change. So these might be things like demographic trends, technological breakthroughs, environmental change. And we look at connections between those forces that are driving change and those actors. And this lets us sort of extrapolate ways that those things might collide to produce plausible scenarios, plausible outcomes. So these aren't predictions per se, they're kind of an exploration of things that could definitely happen because we have the evidence for them today. But probably in reality, maybe a facet of this scenario will come to pass or a facet of that scenario will come to pass. Where this ends up coming in useful from a strategy context is first, you understand the system more deeply. So you can start to make interventions, find leverage points. Another might be that when you're making plans, when you're making strategies, you can kind of use these scenarios as like a wind tunnel to test your strategies, to see how robust they are to this or that sort of change. Like if this outcome happens, how do we do? Versus if that one happens, how do we do? This breakthrough happens, does our scenario actually hold up? Or not.
Right. And so is the idea then sometimes to say, okay, here's our strategy. Is it robust under all the different scenarios? And kind of like trying to kind of say, okay, we don't exactly know which one is going to occur, but if our strategy works for all of these, then we're in a reasonably good shape.
Yeah, I think you can certainly try to use it in that way. I wouldn't think that you could sort of exhaustively map all of the possibilities.
Yeah.
But
That would be impressive.
But I guess I see it as a way of increasing the dimensionality that you're bringing into the decision-making process. We can explore these different scenarios. We can make plans that are more robust. We can make contingency plans that we might pull off the shelf if something comes to pass. One of the ways I've liked to use it as a kind of product-oriented person is to sort of try to step into these scenarios and to try to identify things from that future that might need to exist. And this can be like an interesting way of generating product concepts. I think it's also often used in what people call like wargaming exercises or tabletop exercises. I understand Lux does quite a bit of this. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. We have a whole risk gaming initiative. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I think that when you use it in that way, often the benefit is training. So you're sort of inhabiting a scenario or maybe several different versions of a scenario and playing it out and actually experiencing what that might be like to make decisions under those constraints. And this kind of makes you ready. It gives you this intuition for how things might unfold if you see little hints of that future start to unfold in the actual world that you're sort of living through. So I try to get away from the notion of scenario planning as prediction. I think it's like this gravity well or attractor that people try to pull toward all. I think I listened to a bit of Nick Foster's pod as well, and I think he made the same point. I guess the way I think about this is there's sort of a spectrum here. There's a difference between risks, which are situations where you can pretty much anticipate the outcomes. and maybe even start assigning probabilities to those outcomes. An example of this might be like playing a game of chess. Like, I'm going to win, or you're going to win, or there's going to be a draw. We might be able to assign probabilities of like who's going to win based on our skill level. But in a sense, there's a lot of known unknowns. Like, we kind of know the set of things, the set of outcomes, right? Where I tend to reach for scenario planning is in conditions not of risk but of uncertainty. So uncertainty, this is sort of something that was developed by an economist, Knightian uncertainty, Frank Knight.
I was just gonna say like Knightian uncertainty of you don't even know kind of what you're dealing
You
with.
don't even know. Yeah, you don't even know. So not you don't know the probabilities of the outcomes. You don't even know the possible outcomes, right?
Yeah,
and so this sort of demands a different way of approaching problems. It's really tricky. And a lot of the time, I think we fool ourselves when we try to apply the tools that we would use to manage risk, like portfolio theory or maybe like forecasting, to situations that are fundamentally uncertain. So where I find scenario planning pretty interesting as a sort of tool in the tool belt for navigating those kinds of situations is most of what you're doing is exploring your environment, trying to understand sort of what's moving quickly, what's moving slowly. How does this sort into pace layers? Who are the actors? And these actors might come and go. New ones might arise. What are the forces involved that are sort of driving change over longer time horizons? And you're able to start to maybe pin down some of those unknown unknowns, make them a little more known. But there's going to be fundamentally just a lot, like a lot of unknowns, even when you can sort of pin down most of it. And that's where this kind of this wind tunneling, these wargaming or tabletop exercises come in. You're sort of training for being able to act under high uncertainty, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess, and how would you think about kind of the relationship between like placing bounds on our uncertainty as like part of the reason you run these kind of exercises? So there's like placing bounds under our uncertainty, trying to figure out how we might act under uncertain conditions, and then also just kind of giving us a sense of like intellectual humility of like realizing, oh wow, there are so many more things than we probably can imagine. Like, I imagine to a certain degree scenario planning and other kinds of techniques are doing a little bit of all of these, but how do you think about what are the most productive ways of approaching that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I understand you teach some of these methods too, so I'd be curious to hear your take. But when I approach this from my sort of product perspective, I guess I'm a little less interested in trying to exhaustively map the space of all possibility. And I'm a little more interested in trying to find what the crux issues are. Like, where are those uncertainties that matter for the sort of outcomes that we care about? Where can we find agency? Where can we find opportunities for innovation? Where can we find breakthroughs? It's less of an exhaustive mapping exercise and maybe more of like a dowsing kind of experience or an exploratory experience. You're kind of navigating all of these evidence-based structural factors that you're tracking, like the forces driving change, the actors, this kind of thing, the connections between them. So you know that these things exist in the world today. You're not projecting them, you're not making them up. You can usually point to something like a news article that may have inspired one of these pieces of evidence or scientific paper, but you're sort of letting yourself mentally play out the consequences of that event or that breakthrough or that environmental change and how it might collide with others. So it's this kind of I guess in AI, right, you sort of have these top down, almost like annealing methods, and then you have these generative methods like LLMs, right? They just sort of mash things together and they generate them from the bottom up from a set of rules like grammar. And I like to use scenario planning in this way rather than trying to exhaustively map everything. Use it as a kind of generative tool for inspiration, and not just for predicting, but also for perhaps uncovering plausible futures that we might want to sort of tilt the scales toward, right? So there's like some agency here. It's not just that you're standing at a distance watching the system sort of separate from it. You're
Right.
You're also a part of it, right?
Right. It's not just washing over you. You kind of have a sense, oh, here are the forces, here are the ways we can actually maybe make an impact or kind of, affect things at the margins. I guess, to maybe make it a little bit more concrete, maybe going back to like the product aspect of this, maybe you can talk a little bit about what scenario planning looks like in the product world, or at least the way that you kind of worked with it.
Yeah. A lot of the methodologies are very similar, whether you're talking like defense applications or environmental applications or business applications. In a product setting, I would often go through a scenario sprint with people at Mozilla or at Google. We would usually start with a question. So this is something I really like, actually. Scenario planning doesn't pretend to be a kind of objective from the outside method. It sort of starts with what your goals are. So you start with a focal question or sort of area of focus. You want that focal question to have good time and space bounds. Let's say maybe we have a question like how are AI agents going to change the web, right? So that's sort of like maybe the beginning of a focal question, but it doesn't have really good boundaries.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a question. It has a directionality. Like we're interested in AI agents, we're interested in the web, but maybe we could put like a little bit of a time horizon on it. Like how might AI agents transform the web over 10 years? So now we've got a kind of time boundary, 10 years, or maybe let's say 5 years. And we've got a sort of like a space or a topical bound. We're interested in AI, we're interested in agents, we're interested in the web. That's a pretty decent focal question. It gives us like a direction of travel. It helps us scope our research. From there, I often like to look at who is interested in this in this question, right? So I'm interested because I'm running the research, but we also have probably OpenAI cares, probably many governments care. I suspect a lot of the people who work on the web, these standards bodies care, Cloudflare, right? These kind of major actors. You try to map these people out. Maybe you start asking questions, making little dossiers for them, like what are their motivations? How are they connected? Who are their allies? Who are their competitors? This already starts to reveal some really interesting structural factors. It's like, okay, maybe the people who are working on the protocols or the standards have motivations that are quite different to the people working on foundation models like OpenAI or the people working on infrastructure like Cloudflare. And you can start to imagine how they might interact to create, interesting outcomes. The next phase, though, I feel like this is the real backbone of scenario planning. And I'd be kind of curious to get your read on this. So I like to look at the sort of forces that are driving change in the environment. So these are often like there are certain things that happen that tend to be like a small stone thrown into a pond and they don't have a lot of impact, but occasionally you have like a big stone that leaves a lot of ripples, a lot of knock-on effects. There are a few heuristics for trying to identify these. One is it's called STEEP, which stands for social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. There's nothing magic about this, but it's a set of categories that tends to have lasting impact, right? When a law changes or when a regime changes in the sort of political sphere, that can have lasting effects. When the climate changes or when, maybe a lake runs dry or, you have drought in certain regions, monsoon changes, like these have dramatic and lasting effects. Likewise, technological breakthroughs. So you start to collect these things. One way I like to do this is by taking a kind of trend hunting maybe approach. So scanning news, using Google, using tools like Google has this really interesting tool where you can look at the change in terms, search terms used over time. These can be
Yeah.
interesting. You're looking for hints.
Okay.
You're looking for sort of hints that fit into maybe one of these categories, but that might grow to be like these larger stones that create larger ripples in the pond.
No, I love this. And so, okay, so you're doing this, and then, okay, so you have a number of different factors and a number of different changes and things like that. And then do you kind of group them together and make sort of some sort of clusters, and then based on that, begin to kind of coalesce different scenarios that you're kind of imagining? And because, and to be honest, I like one of the things that I actually find very appealing and very interesting, and especially in the way you describe this, is and this is really, it feels like a very structured way of researching a question. Which I think is ultimately what it is, where it's like you take something that's very amorphous and like, oh, what are things to be like in the future? And the obvious answer is, I don't know. But you can still say, okay, I don't know, like in a certain way. And then this kind of process is going very, very deliberately through this entire research, like figuring out, okay, what are the factors? How do we think about this? Let's kind of like try to constrain the question. And so, okay, so you've done all this research. What is the next? My sense is like the next step is almost like a certain aspect of like storytelling, figuring out what these things are when they all combine together.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that you can use these ingredients. I feel like you're building up a really coarse-grained kind of model of the world when you do this sort of research. So you've got these driving factors, these major actors or stakeholders in the environment. One thing that ends up being very generative is to try score them on the level of impact you think they might have with regard to your question, and also your level of certainty about the outcome. So let's think of an example. In the AI and agents example, we might have something like Moore's law. Like that has it's had a pretty clear directionality for a really long time. So, pretty high impact if you're thinking about compute and LLMs, they need a lot of compute. What is the certainty there? I don't know about you. I feel like in the past it might have been quite certain, but it seems like just based on scanning our environment, reading some papers, we're maybe running up against some ceilings. Perhaps we find, a breakthrough. We find a new way of doing lithography that unlocks something. I know there's some startup that's working on this in the US right now. So who knows? It could keep going, or maybe it could even accelerate, or it might slow down. I would put my personal level of certainty about the continuation of Moore's law over a 10-year time horizon as kind of low, but it seems like a very high impact factor, right? So once we've sort of scored a bunch of these things, maybe tens or hundreds of forces, we can start to look at how they might cross up. So often you can start to, just by sorting by impact and uncertainty, you can start to immediately see there are going to be sort of two categories or two clusters of forces that matter a lot. One is forces that are high impact and very low uncertainty, like we're quite certain about the outcome. So you could think of these as like the backbone of many different scenarios. Like these are forces that are going to drive change in almost any future that we end up in, right?
Would this be like, again, like, would this be something like population size, like over time? Like we kind of know, or even just like the number of adults that they're going to be in 5 to 10 years. Like we that with a very high degree of certainty based on just the number of children, then you kind of extrapolate their ages. And that will also have an impact. Is it something like that, or is it something else as well?
No, that's a great example, actually. Something like demographic trends. Like I would say over shorter time horizons, 5-10 years, they're really certain because they have a momentum that you can't really thwart. Like a baby is born, that baby's going to carry out a life. That life is going to be, probably somewhere around 80 years. It's got a lot of built-in momentum. So the people that are here are likely to remain here. And we can make some pretty confident projections. I think once you start pushing out beyond half a generation, it starts to get really uncertain again,
Sure.
that particular force, right? Because it's like, well, maybe birth rates go up, maybe they go down, really depends on a lot of factors. But yeah, that's exactly it. There are some forces that you just kind of know their direction of travel, you can right size their impact. They're going to make a difference in a lot of scenarios. The other, I think, really important sort of cluster of forces to pay attention to are forces that are high impact, for your question, and also high uncertainty. Like we just don't know the outcome, right? So this tends to be where plot twists come from, or maybe like Talebian black swans, right? It's like things that they definitely exist, but they're kind of unclear which direction they might go. Maybe an example of this in the AI space would be, where's the ceiling on LLM performance? Are we close to it? Right? It seems like we keep almost hitting it, and then new things like synthetic training data might, raise the ceiling. But like, let's say in a 5 or 10-year time horizon, I don't have a high certainty about that, about what the outcome might be there. But it seems pretty high impact for a question like how AI agents might change the web. So we can often kind of look at this set of forces, these plot twist forces, high uncertainty, high impact, and identify like maybe 2, 3 that feel like cruxes, like they're just kind of really representative of the question at hand. Maybe we might feel that they're like really important to us because perhaps we have a hand on the lever. Like they might be things that we can actually affect. There's a little bit of like a subjective aspect to, I think, this phase of scenario planning. Through, I think, skilled decision making, incorporating a lot of stakeholders, you sort of narrow these down. What you can start to do is take these forces and cross them up. Like a very easy way to do this might be to take 2 forces and just make a 2 by 2. So one force on the x-axis, one force on the y-axis. And you look at this highly uncertain, high impact force at each of these, and you basically try to judge an extreme outcome for each one. So, let's say the ceiling on LLMs is enormously high. We just get incredible performance out of it. That might be one extreme. Another extreme might be like, we've basically hit the limit. We're pretty close, right? Like we're at diminishing returns.
Right, we're there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of doing this off of the top of my head. Maybe
Yeah,
there's
no, but
some.
right, and yeah, because you would have those two, then you have some other force, and you say, okay, like this one continues, the other one doesn't, and then you end up, with like 4 different quadrants.
Maybe just a little sidebar here, but one reason I really enjoy this is because I feel like it cultivates epistemic humility. Like there's often a kind of, we all have skin in the game in one way or the other, and we tend to like invest in one sort of narrativized outcome for something like AI, or another narrativized outcome for something like AI. And maybe our narrative is very tied to where our paycheck comes from or our other incentives in life. And what's interesting to me about kind of breaking the events down and trying to find the system underneath is you start to realize the range of the plausible, of the possible, is pretty wide. Actually, it's pretty wide. And when you cross these forces up that way, you end up with basically 4 windows into possible futures. It's like these two crux forces could collide in 4 different ways. And often those windows, they're very evocative, I find. I'd be curious to hear your experience with this, but I find that they provoke a lot of follow-on thought. Like you can immediately start to like put flesh on that scenario, to start to inhabit it. This is where maybe the narrative aspect of scenario planning kicks in.
Right, where it's like you have these 4 different plausible scenarios, right? And your goal is, okay, you have to tell a story, kind of get a sense of like how to handle these kinds of things. And then, right, like oftentimes when you do that, it becomes much more real in a way where if you were not doing this scenario planning and you just had certain assumptions of, oh yeah, like LLMs they're going to, I don't know, they're going to top out very soon, or we're going to go much further. Like, rather than having those assumptions, you can then begin to imagine what these different worlds can look like. And I think then it makes it a little bit more, I don't know, maybe not quite tractable, but certainly makes it more tangible.
Yeah, this is going to be a very poor example of 4 windows because I'm just literally taking it off the top of my head.
Yeah,
But maybe you could cross up something like LLM performance curve with something like, I guess if we're thinking in the 5-year time frame, like economic force, like does an AI bubble pop within that time frame?
Okay,
I think we often
interesting.
tend to bundle those questions together, like
Oh, that's
if there's a bubble, AI must be fake, right? But these are actually 2 different things that are playing out. One in the technical domain, the other in the economic domain. Like capital is sort of rushing AI because it sees a lot of promise. At the same time, technology is, there are a lot of researchers working on this problem. And these 2 forces interact in really nonlinear ways, right? So like you might have a world where actually the ceiling on LLMs is pretty high, but there's a bubble at a bad time, and this causes a winter, and perhaps it takes a while before that scenario sort of unfolds in a meaningful way for the question. Or you might have a world where the bubble doesn't pop, the ceiling is also high, right? And you get like a lot of acceleration. I think generally you're looking for forces that play against each other in interesting ways. I think these 2 forces that I just sort of pulled off the top of my head are a little too close maybe to each other.
right. You
But
need
you're
something a
looking
little bit
for,
more orthogonal. Yeah.
yeah, you're looking for orthogonality, for productive sort of contrast. And I think especially if you're using this as a strategic tool, you're looking for ways to maybe like get a little bit uncomfortable, to kind of grapple with your uncertainty in productive ways and like live in that tension and explore it a little bit. And I think that's where a lot of the breakthroughs come from. There are other ways you can use this kind of matrix, the scenario matrix. So one might be wargaming. You could use the forces and the scenarios that you've established as kind of the bounds for setting up a war game or a tabletop game. So you might be able to establish things like who the actors are in that war game, what some sort of plausible rates of things changing is, what the rules are. Another one that I love to do is to sort of try to step into a future to flesh it out as almost like a little story or vignette, and use it as a kind of intuition pump or exploratory, like almost like a design tool, right? Where we can spot things from the future that might soon exist. And maybe we want to get a jump on building those things, right? Or maybe we want to head them off if they're bad. It's interesting. I think once you get into the narrative end of the spectrum, scenario planning starts to cross over with a lot of other areas, like simulation. If I remember, you had someone who had studied SimCity on. Is that right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it was
So
Chaim Gingold wrote the book Building SimCity, and he actually worked for Maxis a number of years ago as well. So yeah.
Incredible. Yeah. And with wargaming, I really feel like there's a really funny, if you squint, there's a lot in common between tabletop wargaming and tabletop role-playing games. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I
It's like,
mean,
in
you're
role play.
you're spinning on a scenario and telling a story, and like there's rules.
Yeah, yeah. There's
yeah.
a world that you're kind of inhabiting together and maybe like collectively telling a story about. Like if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, your goal is maybe just to step into that world and experience it for fun, right? It might not be a plausible world, but I think maybe we can use these same techniques in ways that are more like evidence grounded to actually to learn about what might come to pass or to train for things that might happen. I think of a lot of those things like TTX or RPGs as they're like tools for telling stories together. Like I think it's often
Right. Yeah.
yeah, it's a little bit difficult maybe to if you and I were just told to make up a story on the spot, it's kind of tough, right? And what they give us, what these techniques give us, is a sort of framework to be able to tell the story in a collaborative fashion together or experience a story together. So this is, I think, maybe where the rubber meets the road with scenario planning and product. But it's used in a lot of different contexts. Adversarial contexts like defense. It's also used in, I think, insurers use it. Some value investors and VCs use it. Everybody wants to know the future. So
Yeah.
I don't think it won't tell you the future, but it'll tell you maybe several plausible ones, and you can triangulate accordingly. Maybe even use it as a kind of normative tool to try to like push for one or the other.
Of like this is the one that seems like both possible and the one that we clearly want, and so kind of how can you move towards that? And I guess related to that, like, are there like what are the I guess the misuses of scenario planning? Is it people really trying to use this as some sort of like very clear like future prediction kind of thing? Like it's almost like like, oh, like this is like a soothsaying sort of thing. Like is that where the misuses lie? Are there other kinds of misuses? Is it maybe a sense that, oh, we've laid out these 4 different scenarios, these are, and then thinking that these are the only 4 that are possible, kind of almost like limiting your imagination? Like where do you see the misuses there, or maybe the perils?
Yeah, I think one that I find I really have to work as a facilitator um, at heading off is seeing these as concrete predictions. People often want to put probability bounds on these. So I've been working on a AI scenario planning tool, and some early research funding for that work has actually come from sort of AI risk, people who are interested in AI risk. And in that community, they really like the idea of forecasting a
Right, I was going
lot.
to say there's a lot of overlap with the forecasting community there.
Yeah. So you have, Philip Tetlock developing super forecasting, and there are people who apparently are statistically sort of able to make predictions about the future much more effectively than others. But I would say that I don't think you want to reach for scenario planning to solve forecasting problems, and I don't think you want to reach for forecasting to solve scenario planning problems. Like to me, this comes back to the risk versus uncertainty duality. If it's a risk, if you can judge the set of outcomes that you're interested in and you're very confident that there aren't any that you've missed, you're probably in a risk situation, and you might want to start trying to assign probabilities to things. You might want to hire a super forecaster. Like I know a few of these guys, like Nuno at Sentinel. They run a newsletter, kind of doing super forecasting around world events, and are apparently quite successful at it. But I think you need pretty high levels of certainty to be able to engage effectively in that kind of forecasting activity. Where scenario planning ends up being useful to me, or its use rather than misuse, is when you're in these very ambiguous. I guess the military calls it VUCA: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. If any of those things feel true, you might want to reach for scenario planning. So it's sort of it's a method that sort of embraces uncertainty a little bit more. Another, I would say, maybe misuse of scenario planning is it is really easy to generate very negative scenarios. I don't know about you. I've puzzled over why this is. Like people
Oh, that's interesting.
gravitate towards, the sort of negative trends, and so it can get very doomery, and that's really not very intellectually honest, because the real world we live in is very unevenly distributed. There are lots of bad things, there are lots of good things, and it seems pretty plausible to me that like most scenarios will also embrace a lot of that spectrum. I think maybe after puzzling as a facilitator doing scenario planning workshops for a long time over why this is, I remember Brian Eno, the musician, making this point that the funny thing about uh, disasters or dystopias or terrible outcomes is that they usually are what you get when you take the status quo and remove something load bearing. So we all know the status quo, right? Like we're all pretty we all have like a pretty firm grasp of how the world is today, and it's pretty easy to remove, right? To remove something. I think that's it's almost like a low energy kind of
Right,
approach to
right.
this stuff. What's trickier is, I think, anticipating plot twists, like thinking of what you don't know that might come into the picture. Often a lot of beneficial outcomes, a lot of positive outcomes come from left field. They come from the fringes, and they're difficult, I think, to just sort of imagine on the spot. So one of the things I try to do as a facilitator is sort of act as, as the resident optimist, uh,
Oh, interesting.
I try to yeah try to look for evidence of positive outcomes and fold those in so you get a more textured and a more nuanced uh, and probably realistic sense of what might come to pass.
So interesting. And related to this new tool that you're working on, I mean, you've talked a whole bunch about kind of the process of building these, of doing scenario planning and kind of building these scenarios. It's obviously a very long and kind of involved process of research and development, kind of talking to people, lots of people and stakeholders and everything like that. Presumably you cannot do that often then, because it's a lot.
Costly. It's
Yeah, yeah. I
costly.
was gonna
Yeah.
say, yeah, maybe you can kind of talk about and the kind of the current status quo in terms of kind of like the amount of effort that is required, and then what your tool is designed to kind of step in and maybe relieve some of that burden.
It's a real challenge. I've personally found scenario planning as a research method, as a sort of strategy method, to be enormously valuable. Really, to do this effectively, you kind of need to pull in a lot of experts, maybe half a dozen people. At one point, I pulled in a lot of the leadership of the Chrome team. We did some scenario planning around, web protocols, web standards. I felt it was enormously effective. But like, imagine how much that's costing these highly paid Google executives, getting them all in a room. They're very busy people, right? Very busy. So like, there's a huge, I think, cost in terms of time and the number of people you need to bring together. These research processes are also pretty involved. Often scenario workshop might take 3 days, might take a week. If you're really practicing this stuff very rigorously, you want to keep scanning the environment and sort of generating scan hits, updating your scenario models, updating your scenarios, playing through those updated scenarios. This happens in certain contexts, like I'll bet Shell does this pretty regularly. Defense does this. I'm sure the US military has done loads of explorations of things like what happens if China invades Taiwan, for example. But I think it's just out of reach for most people, right? And for
Right.
most
Yeah.
questions. So I started getting really interested in how we might do something about that. And I guess I'm a software guy. I'm a product guy. I've been working with LLMs and with AI agents for quite a while, and I was wondering, I wonder if we could actually automate aspects of this or accelerate them. I think I'm less interested in taking humans out of the loop, because a big value of scenario planning is the learning that you absorb along the way. You come away seeing the world with different eyes. And I want to be part of that process. I don't want to take myself out of it. But it does feel like there's a lot here that's just sort of like turning the crank. Like, I need to chew through thousands of news articles. I need to tag them. I need to summarize them. I need to decide if they're relevant. Can we triage some of this, for example? Can we maybe even automate some of, if I give it a news article, can we get an LLM to accurately identify who the major actors are, maybe what some of the forces are that are underneath that are driving those events? So I started doing some research in this direction and got a bit of research funding. I think, LLMs, they're in this interesting sort of place as a technology right now. I don't know what your experience is with them, but I find that they're remarkably good at some things and remarkably bad at others. I like I like to
Yeah.
think of they're really good at taking sort of fuzzy things and maybe putting those fuzzy things into buckets, like categorizing them, summarizing them, maybe generating, like, let's say, some hashtags for some content. These kinds of discrete kind of like, let's take the fuzzy amorphous vibey thing and try to like put some bounds around it or put it in a box, classify things. Yeah, I started looking at LLMs and where they were and scenario planning and thinking, scenario planning is a very developed research method. There are some extremely well articulated versions of it, like Houston Framework Foresight, that just go into great detail about how to carry out each of the steps. I think a skilled facilitator sort of skillfully chooses between those methods, maybe bends or adjusts them to the context, to the question. But you can kind of look at these methods and say, they look a little bit like prompts, you know? In a way, I like to think of facilitating or workshops as a way of folding together inputs from a lot of different points of view. And so you can sort of squint and say, maybe we can look at the scenario process as a way of folding together the perspectives of a lot of different agents and human researchers that want to participate in that process. So that's how I started working on Deep Future, which is my tool, my product, I guess, that's sort of developing scenario planning on top of basically an AI engine.
That's amazing. No, I love that. Yeah, and is the idea, like the goal with Deep Future is not just to kind of make it easier for the people who are already using scenario planning, but it's almost like to democratize this process and be like, oh, like if you kind of thought this was out of reach or never even thought of it as a tool in your process for strategic thinking for your company or whatever it is, this is now the kind of thing that will hopefully be able to be reached, be within reach for lots of people and organizations.
That's my hope. I mean, as someone who's working in product, but I think this could be useful in many contexts, but I've often found myself wanting to reach for scenario methods, but maybe it's just me in the room, right? Or maybe it's me and a couple other people, right, who are working on the problem. Maybe we can't get critical mass of like stakeholders in the room. Maybe we can't devote 3 days to, and I feel like there are a lot of questions in my life that I would love to do a scenario sprint on. If I'm reading the paper and I see something about rare earth minerals, what is that? Like,
Yeah.
how do I learn more about this? I started thinking, wouldn't it be great if we had something that was kind of like AI deep research, like Claude Deep Research or OpenAI Deep Research. So what those tools do is basically they automate aspects of the research process, like a lit review process. They go out, crawl the web, they find a bunch of resources, they make a synthesis. I feel that it probably doesn't replace a room full of analysts, but I don't have a room full of analysts, right? And I find myself using this all the time. So I wondered if there's a similar move here. Like, I don't think AI is going to replace Peter Schwartz anytime soon, but there's just there's a lot of questions that it feels like, what if we could just lower the floor, like bring down the cost and the investment that has to go into this process? Could we actually, increase the dimensionality of our thinking, increase the quality of our strategic planning by automating some aspects of the research process?
I love that. And then related to, you mentioned like reading the newspaper and immediately wanting to like run like a scenario sprint. I guess maybe my last question is like, how has working with scenario planning more broadly, like, how has it changed the way you think about like viewing society and the world?
Yeah, personally, I guess exploring these different scenarios, it makes you step into these worlds that are pretty fully realized and that are all plausible. I think it's increased my appreciation for kind of taking a barbell approach to life, like not betting it all on one direction, but maybe trying to think about how might I be wrong, or where might the plot twist come from? How can I sort of make life plans that are a little robust across? I also think a lot in contingency plans and about making small bets that might have very little downside, but potentially high payoff. I don't know about you, but I find myself after practicing this stuff, thinking a lot less in probabilities and being okay with not trying to attach a number to everything and sort of trying to be a little more robust to uncertainties. I think it's a little, maybe a bit similar to the mindset that someone like Nicholas Taleb advocates of sort of cover your downside risk. And this actually lets you take much bigger risks everywhere else. You can take big swings because you've sort of covered your catastrophic downsides by looking at the environment around you more deeply.
I love that. No, I love that kind of, yeah, that sort of, yeah, hedging, humility, kind of like a much kind of more capacious view of where things could go. That, I think that is a great place to end. So thank you so much. This is an amazing conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.